And welcome back to another Econ Podcast with Mr. Hagan. And on this Econ Podcast, we're going to look at economics as a science. And actually, we could debate, is economics a science? Well, it it's not a science like some of the physical sciences where you could do a controlled experiment. So a controlled experiment, we oftentimes, in fact, most of the time in economics, we cannot do controlled experiments. Okay, that's not an option for us because we are studying human beings in society. So we're not a science in that sense. We're not doing controlled experiments, but I guess we could kind of think of ourselves as scientists in the sense that we want to try to follow the scientific method, even if we can't do these perfect controlled experiments. So here's how I want to think about economics as a science. The first step of the scientific method in economics, at least the way that I like to think about it, is to make an assumption. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make an assumption about the world. And what I mean by that is we're going to pretend something is true even if it's not. So we're going to make this assumption, make some assumption. We're going to pretend something's true even if it's not, because it's going to help us learn about the world. So maybe if we are studying the good, let's say that we are studying the good cars. Let's say that's the good that we're studying. We're studying the market for cars. And I want to make an assumption when I study the market for cars. And my assumption is going to be this. My assumption is going to be that there's no change in people's incomes. That incomes do not change. That's going to be my assumption. There's no change in incomes. Now, is that true in the real world? Of course not. People's incomes are always going up and down over time and so on. But I'm going to pretend for the moment that incomes do not change. I'm going to pretend that they do not change. And then I'm going to develop a hypothesis. A hypothesis to me is it's a guess as to how the world works. It's an educated guess as to how the world works. So let's talk about how the world of cars works. Well, here's my hypothesis. Here's my educated guess. Assuming that there is no change in incomes, assuming that that's the case, then I predict this. I predict if you see a decrease in the price of cars, then people will, the result of that is that people will increase the quantity of cars that they buy. They will increase the quantity of cars that they buy. The number of cars purchased will go up. If the price of cars for some reason, I don't know what it is, doesn't matter right now. If the price of cars goes down, people will buy more cars. That's my prediction, assuming that their income does not change. Okay? Now, maybe why do I assume this? Well, because if their income goes up, let's say it this way. If their income goes down, maybe they'll buy fewer cars even if the price goes down because they don't have as much income. See, so what I want to do is I want to kind of try to do a controlled experiment, even though I can't really. I want to try to isolate the variable of price and say, what happens to the quantity of cars if price goes down? Well, if the price goes down, people buy more cars, assuming that income does not change. And then finally, the last step is I collect data and I test the hypothesis. So I go collect data over time. Here I would collect data about the price of cars. I would collect that data for maybe every month. What's the average price of a car? And then the number of cars that were purchased. The number of cars that were purchased. I would collect that data each month, and then I would compare these two and say, does the data that I collect, does it support my hypothesis? Does the data show that it's true that when the price of cars go down, people buy more? Okay. Now, again, this is not perfect because we don't have a controlled experiment. We can't control if people's incomes are going up and down during the time that we collected the data. There are ways to try to get around that. That's not the purpose of this podcast. That's something we may talk about later on. We'll talk a little bit more about the scientific method on the next video. This has been Mr. Hagan, and we'll see you on the next podcast.